it's really at the ecosystem level that we sort of interface with a great many of our of the problems in the so-called human predicament. What you should remember, though, always when you're thinking about these things is that the ecosystem is simply the community of organisms that lives in an area, the organisms interacting with each other and interacting with their physical environment. You can sort of picture it as energy flowing in from the sun. Thank you. Decaf, thank you. Energy coming in from the sun. It's passing, you can think of upward through the food chains, through the consumers, plants, to the consumers, to the various levels of predators. You always want to remember, though, that at each of those levels, both in waste products and in shed scales and leaves and in dead bodies, a contribution in energy is being made. You can think of sort of downward into this vast decomposer level, much of which is in the soil and terrestrial systems, and which is extraordinarily important to the whole system. A lot of the action in this one-way flow of energy. The energy flow is one way through the ecosystem. Why? Because of the laws of thermodynamics that we discussed last time. But you have materials, and that includes gaseous materials, cycling through the entire system, and an awful lot of the action takes place in the soil. As I said last time, never underrate the soil. Now, why should we be so concerned? Somebody left some keys here. Does anybody? Why should we be so concerned with the functioning of ecosystems? Well, the way we generally put it to people is we should be so concerned because ecosystems supply humanity with a wide range of vital services that are free services and that are often discussed as ecosystem services. And you already can imagine what they are from the discussion last time. Ecosystems, including the organisms working in the ecosystems, especially the organisms working in the ecosystems, maintain the gaseous quality of the atmosphere. You'll recall that, for instance, until photosynthetic organisms began to put oxygen into the atmosphere, we had a reducing atmosphere. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere. And therefore, the very presence of oxygen that allows us to exist as people, but also basically allowed life to come out on land, is due to an ecosystem service. Remember, before there was enough oxygen to produce ozone, to get the ozone shield, you had that vast flux of UVB coming in from the sun, and life had to hide in the water. So basically, the ecosystems themselves developed the possibility of invading the land. There, of course, are much more detailed ways in which the gaseous quality of the atmosphere is being maintained by natural ecosystems. And I mentioned them last time, for instance, with the injection of CO2. The increased injection of CO2 into the atmosphere is changing that quality. Lots of things that human beings are doing are affecting the gaseous content of the atmosphere, and in ways that we're not too happy about. Some of the other things that we're doing, besides burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 in and increasing the so-called greenhouse effect, is that we're developing huge herds of domestic animals, particularly cattle. And believe it or not, cattle farts are a gigantic source of methane, which is another greenhouse gas. It is one of the major ways. You laugh, but every time you drive by a pasture and hear that horrible sound, you know that the greenhouse effect is being enhanced. And in fact, some people think that the methane and CO2 curves are going to cross, and that actually, in a period of some decades, that actually the methane contribution, not just from there, termites do it too, by the way, but also from methane produced in wetland rice farming, is going to be a contributor to a big contributor to the greenhouse effect. Related to all of this, of course, is that the ecosystems run the hydrologic cycle. Primarily, again, you can look at a diagram in your textbook, but primarily that means evaporating water off of the oceans. It's carried over the land. It falls as rain. But where organisms come into it, of course, very strongly is, for instance, in the activities of plants in transpiring water. As you may know, every drop of water that falls as rain on the Amazon basin, for instance, is cycled several times. There's some dispute about how many times, but a great deal of the rain in a rainforest is recycled water. If you cut down, that's one of the reasons that if you cut down a rainforest, if you destroy that ecosystem, it's very difficult to restore a rainforest ecosystem because the plants themselves are helping to create the climate that is necessary for the plants. The Center for Conservation Biology here has been involved a little bit with Dan Jansen, who is trying to reestablish in Costa Rica an even rarer system than in the Americas than the rainforest, and that is the tropical seasonal forest. Turns out with a seasonal forest, that's one that actually is deciduous. Most of the trees lose their leaves in the dry season. It's not cold and hot, it's wet and dry. The trees tend to lose their leaves in the dry season. And it turns out that those plants are sufficiently tolerant to drought stress that if you plant more of them in an area that has been denuded, say for a cattle ranch, that actually you can restore the tropical seasonal forest. The trouble with trying to restore, in most cases, tropical moist forest, tropical rainforest, is that if you just plant a rainforest tree out in the middle of a pasture, it will die because the climatological conditions aren't right. You've got to have a rainforest to keep a rainforest going. So, very important to us, the role that plants, that organisms play and ecosystems play in running the hydrologic cycle can be dramatically important. If you, for instance, like many people do in Bangladesh, and many people do in the United States, live downstream from areas where the ecosystems are being removed from mountain slopes, you find that instead of having a steady metering of water out into the stream, which is the normal thing when the soils are intact, the plants are doing their thing, and so on, you get a mix of drought and flood. And the floods can be quite horrible and cost many, many lives. So running the hydrologic cycle is very important, and all of this is tied together with what we sometimes talk of as ameliorating the weather or the climate. That is, if you have forest, for instance, it tends to produce a cooler climate in summer, a warmer climate in winter, less wind, so on and so forth. The climate is affected by the ecosystems of the planet. These are all very important services that we get gratis from natural ecosystems. Now, other things that they do for us that are also extremely important is they generate and maintain the soils. And as I mentioned before, without the very complex ecosystems in the soils, we wouldn't be eating, among other things. Remember, for instance, that many times the fungi in the soil are critical to the transfer of nutrients to the plants that you want. Trees, for instance. Soil organisms are extremely important to the soil's fertility. Natural ecosystems also dispose of our waste. We discussed that last time with a famous cat example. If you shoot that cat and leave it in your backyard, it will disappear. That is a natural ecosystem doing its thing, and neighbors might complain first. It depends on how small a yard you have, but otherwise the cat will disappear, and the nutrients in the cat, the process of waste disposal, the nutrients in the cat will be recycled, taken up by what I hope are the native plants in your backyard, and you will then have seen an ecosystem service going on. Ecosystems also control roughly 95 to 99% of all the pests that can attack our crops or that might carry disease organisms, might be vectors of disease organisms. This is something that is dramatically demonstrated every time people overuse synthetic organic pesticides. A classic example was in the Cañete Valley in Peru, now roughly 20 years ago, when they found out if they sprayed a little DDT on their cotton fields. Cotton, by the way, is a major pesticide sink in the United States and elsewhere. Because it doesn't matter, they figure that it doesn't matter how much pesticides you put on it, nobody's going to eat it. If you sprayed a little bit of DDT on, that gave a fewer pests for a while and an increase in yields, then if a little is good, a hell of a lot must be a hell of a lot better. And so they just kept dumping the DDT on. And of course, what you as sophisticated evolutionary biologists now understand is that one of the things that happen is that the pests that you're attacking by repeated attacks with the same pesticide, you're running the organisms over a selectional gradient, and you get, of course, as you always do with bacteria or insects or whatever, if you attack them consistently with the same chemical, they evolve resistance to it. Don't let anybody fool you, by the way. Sometimes somebody will say to you, well, we don't have to worry about pesticides. We can become resistant to them too. That is true. It would take about maybe 15 generations. Human generations are about 25 years apiece. And for each of those 15 generations, we'd have to do what we do with the insects or the bacteria. That is, kill out 99.9% of all the human beings for 15 generations. At the end of that time, undoubtedly, we could create a strain of human beings that were very resistant to, say, parathia. I don't think that's the way we want to control other organisms. But, so you got resistance in the original pests. Worse yet, it turns out, of course, that since plants for many, many millions of years have been trying to keep pests off of them by developing poisons. I think it's probably been mentioned to you that a vast array of things that we use as spices, things that we use to turn on the various active ingredients in grass and cocaine and so on and so forth, are all plant chemicals designed to blow the minds of or kill herbivores. That actually the herbivorous insects have had a lot of evolutionary practice at dealing with poisons. And so what normally happens, both because they have very large populations relative to their predators, an ecosystem thing. Remember, we have the predator populations are going to be less biomass ordinarily than the prey populations. The herbivorous insects become resistant quite rapidly, and they have large populations, which helps them get resistant. They already probably have enzymes that are easily taken over to detoxify our poisons that were once used to detoxify plant poisons. But the predators that eat the insect, that normally eat the insect herbivores, are much more readily killed by the application of the pesticides. So you have a situation in which when you apply lots and lots of pesticides, you normally kill off the predators of the pests more readily than you kill off the potential pests. And so what happens is you get a whole new bunch of pests coming in. When they sprayed the Cañete Valley enough, all of a sudden, instead of having 5 serious pests of cotton, they had 15 serious pests of cotton. What they were doing was destroying a natural ecosystem service. Namely, there were all those hardworking predators out there keeping things from becoming pests. When you all of a sudden wipe out those predators, you've destroyed the ecosystem's pest control function, and all of a sudden you got a mob of pests. Natural ecosystems also are involved in pollinating lots and lots of our crops. Lots of wild bees are important, for instance, in pollinating things like alfalfa. And of course, natural ecosystems supply us with food from the sea, which we discussed some last time, and for some people still, including some hunters in the United States, food from the land. So we do manage to harvest some of our food directly rather than operating through agricultural ecosystems. They also, and maybe one of their most important functions, is maintain what a lot of us like to think of as a vast genetic library, the great diversity of other organisms out there. And that library is important for a lot of reasons. One of them is just plain aesthetic. A lot of us like to see a diversity of organisms. They're interesting to watch. There are something like 60 million bird watchers in North America alone. Some of the most popular TV shows are the nature shows. There is a general feeling in our society that the diversity that is maintained by the ecosystems is important and valuable, and a lot of money is spent on them. Then we get a lot of direct economic benefits out of that library. Humanity has essentially withdrawn from that library the very basis of our existence. 3 scruffy grasses have been taken from those natural ecosystems and through selective breeding turned into what we now think of as corn, rice, and wheat. If it weren't for corn, rice, and wheat, we wouldn't be here today because they're the feeding base of humanity with a few other grains, but more than 1 billion metric tons annually is grown of corn, rice, and wheat. We withdraw from that library also, we have withdrawn from that library also a vast array of these plant chemicals, these co-evolved chemicals which we use as medicines, digitalis for your heart, vincristine and vinblastine to take care of lymphomas, Hodgkin's disease, and so on. Roughly 1/3 of all prescription medicines sold in the United States have either as an active ingredient either a substance from a plant biochemical, or a molecule that was designed to be very much like one, in other words, based on a plant biochemical. So those are very important reasons, and I could go into great detail on both the aesthetic and the direct economic benefit one. By the way, I should say a potential direct economic benefit is what we may get out of genetic engineering. Genetic engineers have to be extremely concerned about the maintenance of biological diversity because, as you know, they don't have a clue and possibly will never have a clue about how to just start out and build things from scratch. What they do, of course, is modify and move around things that are already out there, that are already in the library. Without that library right now, if organic diversity disappeared tomorrow and we somehow managed to survive anyway, which we wouldn't, then the genetic engineers would be instantly out of business. They need that library. But above all, of course, the main reason that we have to be concerned with maintaining that genetic library is the way all those organisms function in the ecosystems, providing us with those ecosystem services without which our society would not persist. In other words, if we seriously damage the delivery of those services, then society as we know it, civilization, certainly will disappear from the planet. Depending on how badly we damage them, that will have a big effect on what the carrying capacity of the planet would be for human beings. But basically, those ecosystems are the source of our income. Our income, again, comes from the sun. It is processed through natural ecosystems, both in terms of bringing us food and bringing us a climate and atmosphere we can live with. And therefore, we have to be very much concerned about the human interactions with that ecosystem. It isn't all a one-way street. It isn't all, as I've already indicated, the ecosystem supplying us with services. We are also tampering with those systems. Now, why are we tampering with those systems? Well, the main reason in a nutshell, and I'll give you a little detail on it, is, of course, that we have increased the scale of human activity to the point where we have simply become a global force. We've done this in two ways. We've done this through population, well, actually three, through population growth, through attempting to increase the affluence per capita in virtually all human populations, and by, in many cases, developing technologies which are not relatively benign towards ecosystems, but are relatively malign, even though in many cases benign technologies are, at least in theory, possible, and in some cases in hand. Now, have they been given the history of human population growth? Well, then I will give you the world's shortest lecture on human population growth. Maybe I'll give it to you in a personal form. Let's count the start of humanity as something a little before Lucy, just for the hell of it. I think that very few people would, if Lucy were here, would consider Lucy something that could be have an experiment done on us. I think we would, people in this class at least, would extend their empathy to a fully upright, rather bright primate that possibly even could talk, although probably not. So let's start humanity 4 million years ago. It took humanity 4 million years to build its population to 2 billion people. 2 billion people were hit on that famous date, as far as I know. I selected a date for it, which was May 29th, 1932. We'll get that down, because that was my birthday. That was when I was born. It took 2 billion years to get from Lucy to me. That's a very Ehrlich-centric view of the universe, but it's easy, therefore, for me to remember. There were only about 5 million people by the time of the agricultural revolution, which was 10,000 years ago. That's when things really started going, for reasons we're not absolutely certain on, but it looks like that the start of agriculture allowed people to have more children closer together. You didn't have to, if you're nomadic, the woman has to carry the offspring and so on. You've got to have some way of finding soft foods to wean kids on. The major thought now is that when we settle down to practice agriculture, although death rates may have stayed relatively high, birth rates started going higher. It's the gap between the birth and the death rates, as you all know, that gives you population growth. And so about 10,000 years ago, we started growing quite rapidly. By 1650, we had about 500 million people, and changes were coming in, like improvements in agriculture using green manure in Europe and so on. By 1850, we had gotten up to 1 billion people. There was a doubling in about 200 years there. Then we entered into the area of modern hygiene, not so much medicine, but just improved hygiene greatly lowered the death rate. In other words, for instance, malaria disappeared from much of the United States and all of Europe before people understood that it was transmitted by mosquitoes. Just the fact that people had enough money to put nets over their beds, just because they drained some swamps and so on. And the general health of the population improved. We got a great spurt of growth, which was pushed along by the start of the biomedical revolution, and by May 29th, 1932, we had doubled again in about 80 years to 2 billion people. How many of you know the size of the world population now? Raise your hands. I'm just curious. How many?
4 billion? 4 to 5.
It's over 5. All right, now, to you, I'm an old fart. To me, I'm still a young guy trapped inside an old fart's body, okay? In the 55 and a half years that I've lived, we have added 1.5 times as many people to the population as in the entire 4 billion years before I was born. When the population bomb was written in 1968, there were 3.5 billion. Today, there are more than 5. The world population is now growing at a rate of about 1.7% annually, and that is not the highest rate ever. The highest rate ever was probably in the late 60s, around 2.1%, but that percentage is being applied to a much bigger base. And so right now, we have the largest annual increment that the world has ever seen. We're adding 84 million people annually to the population. That isn't just how many births we have. That's births minus deaths. In other words, every year we have 84 million more people than we had the year before. You can think of that as a new United States every 3 years to take care of, in one sense or another. And that is a horrendous thing. The fact that there's a lot of point is made about, well, the rate has gone down a little. It's gone down a little primarily because the People's Republic of China, which has 1 billion people in it, has had a very effective population control program, and when you have 1/5 of the people in the world and you have a very effective population control program, then indeed you affect the global statistics rather dramatically. But the basic point still is that ecosystems don't calculate rates. What they understand is increment, is load, the additional people being loaded on, and we are loading on an incredible number of people, and the entire world, of course, is clearly suffering from it. We are overpopulated by either one of the two major standards. Overpopulation is defined sometimes as what happens when numbers are pressing on values. Most of you who've been in a gridlock can see that happening in the United States personally. I think a more effective way of looking at overpopulation and pointing out to you that the entire planet is badly overpopulated is that we are no longer living on income. What we're doing is you can think of humanity as having inherited a vast pile of capital from the planet. That capital basically is our non-renewable resources. And we are doing corporately, as a human family, something that none of you would do if you had any brains in your own family when you get around to having your families. Hopefully most of you don't have big families at the moment. And that is, we are living on our capital. We are not living primarily, we are living on our income too, but we're living in order to maintain 5 billion people, many of them not very well. As you all know, you lead a kind of life that is possibly led by 250 million people, something like that in the world, your lifestyle. Most people live worse than you do, many, much worse than you do, something like 1 billion people in conditions that you would consider absolutely intolerable. We only manage that because we are burning up our capital. Now, what is that capital? Well, the first thing you think of is the fossil fuels. Those are fuels that accumulated many hundreds of millions of years ago, much of them, certainly millions of years ago, all of them, and are produced by very slow geological processes, operating usually on plant materials. So that's what everybody thinks of. They were developed over millions of years. They're being gotten rid of in centuries. Depends on which fossil fuel you pick, how rapidly they're going. That is, there's enough coal and tar sands and things like that around if it becomes economical to exploit them to last us for hundreds of years into the future, which seems like a lot from the point of view of an individual lifespan, but not so much for a humanity that we just decided might have been around for 4 million years. We'd like to think that we might go 4 million years into the future, not just 400 years into the future. Pumpable petroleum may very well give out early in the next century. It depends on a number of assumptions. But there's every sign that we've gone over the peak of extraction. The major question on pumpable petroleum is that there's a small but vociferous group of geologists who think that there's a lot more petroleum very deep down, or natural gas, and that hasn't been settled yet. But at any rate, if we don't have some miraculous finds, pumpable petroleum is going to have been something that lasted about fundamentally 100 years, obviously with tails on each end of the curve. Now, another bit of our capital that we are expending are the other minerals that we need, the metal ores and so on. They, again, accumulate most processes over very, very long periods of time. Tectonic processes are very much involved in generating the minerals. There's a lot of minerals left. Of course, they never leave the planet. What we're doing there is dispersing them. Again, remembering the second law, when you disperse them, you got to use a lot of energy to get them back, and so on. And what we're doing now is moving steadily and rapidly in most minerals to more and more dispersed ores, the thinner and thinner ores, which means we have to use a lot more energy to extract and process the ores, which in turn has all kinds of impacts on the environment and on ecosystems. Because every time you use energy, one of the things the second law tells you, among other things, you generate heat as a waste product, so you tend to alter the climate. So that's both, however, the fossil fuels and the other minerals, that part of our capital that we're expending, if those were the only parts of our capital we're expending, biologists wouldn't be terribly worried, because at least in theory, you've got many decades and maybe even hundreds of years to solve the problems to rearrange our lives so that we don't have to burn those, waste those materials as rapidly as we are now. Much more important in terms of what's going to happen to you are three other forms of our capital. One is Pleistocene fresh water. There's roughly 50 times as much water in aquifers under the United States as falls in the United States annually. And we are very busily emptying those aquifers at rates far beyond their recharge rates. You may all have heard of the Ogallala Aquifer, which is the one that underlies the high plains over much of eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, and so on. which is probably going to be pumped dry in most areas in the next decade or so, in which case when you fly back east, you will no longer see these big circles where the rotary irrigators are going. We'll have to go back to dry land farming in those areas. Probably more serious in the fact that we are pumping out the water more rapidly than it can recharge is that when you do that, very often you permanently end that resource, as happened during the California drought of the mid-70s in several areas where groundwater was pumped too fast, and as a result there was either saltwater intrusion or collapse of the aquifer, either one of which of course destroys turns what was once a renewable resource into one that was non-renewable. Also, as you've all read, all over the United States we are injecting toxic waste into underground aquifers where they travel gradually and form great plumes, but where the normal purifying processes of ecosystems, which are basically run by sunlight and bacteria, don't function very well because there's no sunlight at all and bacterial populations are very thin, a few hundred meters down in the surface of the earth. And finally, again, in the process of turning fresh water into a non-renewable resource, as groundwater, in many areas we're paving over the recharge areas. Long Island's a classic example, where once the water fell in rain and seeped into the soil and percolated down into the aquifers and was saved and became available. You now have parking lots, shopping centers, freeways, and so on. And instead of percolating into the ground, it goes into storm sewers and it runs out to sea, where, of course, it mixes with the salt water, and that's the end of it as far as we're concerned. Many people are of the opinion that the thing that will bring the United States to a grinding halt first, if we manage to avoid a large-scale nuclear war, will simply be the water situation going critical in too many areas. And the United States is in better shape than much of the world. And by the way, I should point out to you that as our population grows, just like as the population grows everywhere, every increment becomes tougher. That is, you got to go further. You got to go to lower grade. You got to go to lower grade minerals. You got to drill your wells deeper for everything. In other words, it costs more for every person you add than it costs for the previous person, because you have to go to resources that are further away, deeper, lower grade, or what have you. So one of the really critical resources that we're not paying enough attention to is our groundwater, part of our capital. A second one is those soils, which I've framed you about almost enough already. I'll just point out that they are, again, formed on a time scale of usually hundreds to thousands of years, and they are being destroyed in many areas of the world, including much of the United States, on a time scale of decades. A very famous agricultural economist, Lester Brown, once said that humanity might survive the exhaustion of the civilization might survive the exhaustion of the fossil fuels, but it certainly won't survive the exhaustion of our topsoil. And finally, and of most concern to biologists, most direct concern to biologists, is that we are losing the other organisms of the planet, which are the working parts of our ecosystems. In many people's opinion, we are starting to enter now into an extinction episode that will be at least as large, if we don't do something about it, and maybe larger than the catastrophic extinction episode of 65 million years ago, in which, among other things, the dinosaurs disappeared, and about which you've doubtless heard much of the controversy at the so-called KT, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. Now, nobody's sure why that happened then, and some people tend to say, well, what the hell, the dinosaurs disappeared, and here we are today, and it didn't make any difference to us, and so why should we worry about having a lot of the organisms disappear today? Well, of course, it has made a difference to us. We wouldn't be here today if the dinosaurs hadn't disappeared, first of all, because it was the dinosaurs that were suppressing our scroungy little mammalian ancestors who were running around in the twilight and snatching eggs out of dinosaur nests and so on, and whatever got the dinosaurs didn't get them, and we, the mammals, have radiated to fill all those niches. Otherwise, you would be being lectured to by an Allosaurus, and you'd all be Diplodocus or something. So, some people say the dinosaurs disappeared and no one misses them. Well, that I can tell you was a lie, because I miss them. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you had a brontosaurus grazing out here on the lawn? I mean, it would be really attractive. Anyway, the second point, of course, and the critical point, is that when the dinosaurs disappeared, there were no human beings trying to run a civilization simultaneously. So the event that got them might be a terribly nasty type of event to get us as well. So we are starting into one of the repeated through geological history, vast catastrophes that several times before have decimated the biota of the planet. This is the first time, as far as we know, however, that the one species out of perhaps 30 million is responsible for doing the job. In other words, we are going to be the causative agent. Therefore, when the price gets paid, at least there will be some little bit of justice in it. Now, We're doing it in all kinds of ways. When people think of the extinction crisis, they tend to think of wiping out the great whales, which is incredibly stupid, and which we have very nearly done, or the German tour group that was caught going back into Hamburg with the last population of a species of cactus in its suitcases, or any number of the other things that we do in terms of direct over-exploiting of either populations or species. The fisheries example that I gave you last time, where we now move from over-exploiting one to over-exploiting another, rather than dealing with sustainable yields. And there's a long harangue I could give you on why I'll give you a short harangue on why we don't deal with sustainable yields. I learned this from a Japanese economist. When I pointed out to him in Japan, I said, look, it's crazy. Every year, the International Whaling Commission tells the Japanese if they take more than X number of blue whale units, that their catch will drop the next time, and they'll have even fewer whales to catch the next year. The Japanese whaling industry must be out of its mind. And he said, you're thinking like a biologist. He said, you're thinking of having a sustainable yield resource and having, for all time, great whales around, and people, if they want to, able to harvest them and make dog food or whatever they want to make out of them. I would disagree with that, because I think we shouldn't harvest them at all, but that's a personal view. But he was saying, biologists always think about sustainable yield. He says, you don't understand that the Japanese whaling industry is not an industry. You've got to think of it as a clot of capital marching across the face of the planet. And what that clot of capital wants to do is maximize its annual return. If they harvest, I'm making up the numbers now, but if they harvest the whales on a sustainable yield basis, they can make 10% a year on their capital. If they harvest the whales fast enough to exterminate the whales, they can make 15% a year on their capital. And when the whales are gone, they'll just take that capital and invest it in raping some other natural resources. They've already got plans to turn their factory vessels into car ferries. And so this is one of the things that's happening to the entire planet, because we're running the planet is being run by politicians with, as Keynes said, idiot economists whispering in their ear, who think that the planet is infinite, and therefore that what you do is, instead of tending your resources and having them around forever, you can simply go on and destroy one resource after another and just keep doing that forever. And you can see this kind of thinking everywhere. That is, you go to maximize your return on your capital today without any thought of what happens in the future. It's happening on our planet. It's one of the reasons that factory farming is considered to be bad by a lot of ecologists. Namely, that instead of having a family farm like they have, say, in Bavaria, where the idea is to try and pass the farm on to your children in even better shape than you received it from your parents. And there's a lot of attention that's paid to soil husbandry and so on and so forth. In a factory farm, in a high discount rate world, nothing more than 6 or 7 years down the line makes any difference at all. So if you're going to destroy the soil in 8 years, that's fine, as long as you maximize the profit now. So we're into sort of a high discount, economocentric world that doesn't think about the ecosystem services that are critical to supporting the economy. The economists put their theoretical thoughts, what there are of them, into how you get things like Pareto optimal distributions of goods. They never think about what is the really crucial question, with a few exceptions like Herman Daly. They never think about what is the truly crucial question in economics today, and that is, how large an economy can we have and still preserve the ecological systems that support the economic system? In other words, that's the critical question. That's the comparison that one ought to be looking at first and foremost, and we're not looking at it. At any rate, that direct exploitation pattern is not the major thing that is causing the great extinction crisis that we're entering today. The major thing is indirect endangering. It is getting rid of habitat, not purposefully, but simply because the way we do things gets rid of habitat. We pave it over. We plow it under to make farms. We, corporately, humanity. We spew all kinds of poisons into the atmosphere. We change the climate. For instance, one of the big concerns among people who are interested in trying to save all the parts, although Leopold once said the first rule of intelligent tinkering is save all the parts. Well, those who are concerned with trying to save organic diversity is, if you make a lot of reserves, and that's what the world is becoming, slowly it's a sea of human disturbance with a relatively small area of relatively undisturbed areas to be protected to save other organisms in. That's not a very good way to go, but at the moment that's the way we're going. And what concerns people in conservation biology is, okay, you got a world dotted with reserves that are essentially islands and seas of human disturbance. And yet here we are adding all this crap to the atmosphere that's changing the climate. As the climate changes, the climate's going to move out of the reserves, but the organisms aren't going to be able to follow because they're basically islands. They can't, they're not going to be able to march through the areas of human disturbance and reestablish themselves somewhere else. So there was just this year a big conference on what the hell do we do about it? How do you manage to conserve diversity in a world where we are now inducing extremely rapid climate change, if the climatologists are right, and everything seems to indicate they are. We're doing all sorts of things to inadvertently or advertently destroy habitat, and it goes right down the line from the things I just mentioned to recreation. How many of you are scuba divers or snorkelers? You should see what happens to a reef when it's really heavily used by scuba divers or snorkelers. In other words, even there, recreational vehicles are an enormous destructive force in the deserts. Scuba divers and snorkelers can be on reefs, just the things we do for recreation. Can have enormous impacts. Even those of us who just like to hike in places like the Sierras, you find that trails are slowly becoming huge patches of erosion and so on because there are so many people who like to hike, that the very values that people now try and seek in wilderness are disappearing. If you go down the Grand Canyon in a raft, they got a good rule. You got to take everything out with you. It means you carry a honey bucket, so everything you take in goes out. But that's the kind of controls that are necessary when you have thousands of people who want to go down this river or that river on rafts each year. Damming rivers is another way in which we destroy both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. You change the characteristics of the stream downstream and upstream, and the river, and of course you flood huge areas. Anyway, a lot of this can be traced back, as I've indicated, just the fact that we have had this enormous explosion of our population, and we have not given anything like enough thought to how to even try and minimize the impact of that population on the planet. We have done recently here at Stanford, Peter Vatusek led a group of us in doing a little analysis of trying to figure out exactly what our impact as a species is on the net primary productivity of the planet. Remember, the basic food resource of all animals. This was possible because there's been so much concern about the CO2 situation, the possible climatic warming, and particularly the changing of the climate due to that warming, that a lot of numbers have been gathered on productivity in various areas, because you got to understand the carbon cycle to understand how CO2 is going. Let me put can I have the screen down, please? Here are some basic numbers, which I'll let you copy down while I bring you. The basic question was, what proportion of the net primary productivity is Homo sapiens, probably one species out of somewhere between 5 to 30 million other species? It shows how poorly we know the biota of the world. What portion of the net primary productivity are we now using? If you use a very conservative estimate, you can see on there that we're using about 3%. But that's extremely conservative. It only indicates our direct use. It doesn't tell us about the use in systems that we have created, which are no longer like natural systems. And when you add that in and then look at what we have foregone, can everybody read that in the back, or you can't? I'll just leave it on here for a couple minutes at the end of the lecture so that you can come up closer and get it. I think you ought to have those numbers, not because I think you ought to be quizzed intensively on them, but just because it's a kind of frightening thing to think that you can actually come up with an estimate that we are using something on the order, using or foregoing something on the order of 40% of the net primary productivity, of the net primary productivity on the planet. That estimate may be way off. Let's suppose it's only 25%. I'm only talking terrestrial. It turns out, because of the situation in food chains that we discussed last time in the oceans, that we only use a very small proportion of the productivity of the oceans, and it doesn't look like we can get at much more of it. We're closer to the limits probably of using the productivity of the oceans than we are of using the productivity on the land, even though we may be at 30 or 40% on land and only at 2% on the oceans. That's science for you. But the crucial thing is, here we are using 40% of what we've got to share, or using 25%, or even using 10% of what we've got to share with 30 million other organisms, if we didn't care about the existence of those organisms, if it wasn't crucial to us what happened to them, even so, here we are, a species that is planning, put it in quotes, to double our population in something like the next 50, 60, 70 years, depending on what assumption you make. In other words, I don't know anybody who thinks there's much chance of halting the human population explosion before we pass through 8 billion and probably 10 billion, except that almost all the ecologists, myself included, think that it will end long before that because the death rate will rise. But if you, like the average demographer, don't understand that death rates can do something besides go down, that they can also come back up, then the assumptions have to be that we're going to go through 8, 10, maybe even 16 billion people before we can start a decline to a sustainable number. Nobody knows what a sustainable number is because it depends, of course, on what the condition of the world is when you try and reach a sustainable number and what kind of lifestyle and technology you use to sustain it. I don't know no analyst who thinks that 5 billion people is sustainable permanently with anything remotely like our present levels of affluence or technology. In other words, everybody's opinion is we're already far above, we're in a situation of overshoot, far above the kind of human population size that could be supported even on a 1,000 or 10,000 year basis, let alone on a several million year basis. Fortunately, we have a very long time to worry about how small the population ought to be once we get it started shrinking, because even if you had full control and could make it shrink at your will, you would want it to shrink it very slowly to avoid all kinds of disruption. The only humane way to do it is, of course, to lower the birth rate slightly below the death rate for a very long time. Now, why is everybody who thinks about these problems put so much focus on population? Well, the main reason is very simple, and if you think back to what you've had in the way of demographic statistics, you'll see it immediately. It takes a very long time from the time you hit a net reproductive rate of 1, that is R0 equal to 1, in a population where you have overlapping generations, until you actually start a halt population growth or start a decline. The actual numbers, it ordinarily takes about a life expectancy. That is, if you reach a net reproductive rate, as we did, of 1 or a little below actually in the United States around 1970, it's going to be about 65 or 70 years after that you actually have the halt to growth in the United States from having a surplus of births over deaths. The reason is very simple, of course, and that is you got to wait. You have a very young population when the population is growing rapidly. Your age composition is such that you have, in many poor countries, something on the order of 45% of your people under 15 years of age. They are going to have babies, and their children, they're going to live alongside their children who are going to have babies, and they're going to live alongside their grandchildren while they have babies. There's going to be a lot of reproduction before they get up into the higher age classes, into the 65-year age classes, 65 to 70, 75 to 80, and so on. Where the death rates become very high. And remember that you don't get zero population growth. You don't get a stationary population until the overall birth rate and the overall death rate are in balance. So when you have a young population, you get a lot of reproduction before the population age composition changes enough to really raise your death rate. Now, if you didn't follow that, think about it, but I can give you the consequences very simply. Take India, which has about 800 million people today and has an average family size in the vicinity, something like 4.4 children. Let's suppose over the next 30 years that there was a population control miracle in India, and the average family size came down to replacement level, say 2.2 kids might be replacement level there. You got to have the 0.2 in there to take care of the ones who die before they reach reproductive age. Then you'd have a situation where your net reproductive rate would be 1, and eventually the population would stop growing when the age composition adjusted to the new net reproductive rate. In those circumstances, it would take about 100 years for the Indian population to stop growing. In other words, if you had a population control miracle, in 30 years you got the Indian birth rate down far enough so you hit a net reproductive rate of 1, as we did in 1970, the Indian population would stop growing in about 100 years, and at that time there would be about 2 billion people in India. That is about the same number of people there were on the entire planet when I was born. That's the kind of numbers that make biologists very, very nervous. How are you going to support 2 billion people in India if you're lucky with population control, plus how many knows how many more around the rest of the planet? So the thing is, you have this enormous built-in momentum to population growth, which means if you want to affect the population size and you want to do it humanely without people dying off, you got to start years ago, basically. And that's why one always puts the first emphasis on population size, because there's nothing you can do about that in sensibly or humanely without having a long lead time. Whereas if you tell everybody to stop having babies for 10 years and so on, you disrupt society enormously. People won't pay any attention to you. Then you won't, the baby food manufacturers all go out of business, and then of course 10 years later you're going to have babies again. You just can't do it. So you got to do it gradually. It takes a hell of a long time. You should not mistake this, though, for the idea that population control is a panacea. It's crystal clear, if you can't tell by watching the evening news, that if we didn't grow by another person or even began shrinking, that most human problems would still be with us. We'd still have racism, we'd still have the threat of war, we'd still have sexism, we'd still have religious prejudice, we'd still have unequal distribution of goods, and they're horribly unequal within nations, between the rich and the poor nations, and so on. All of those things would be with us, and in fact, if everybody started behaving like Americans, we could destroy the ecosystems of the planet with just 5 billion people, probably with just 2 billion people. So population control is not in any sense a panacea. What one can say is, however, that whatever cause you have, it's going to be a lost cause if you don't have population control. If you want, let's suppose that one of the things that concerns you, as it ought to, is how do you get the people in the poor countries to live a decent life, so among other things, you don't have to worry about what threat they'll be to you when they all have nuclear weapons, which they all will have in another 10 or 20 years as the world is now going. Well, if you look at the situation in a country like Mexico, maybe the one we should be paying most attention to in Latin America. But focusing our attention on Nicaragua, well, what's going on in Mexico is going on in Mexico without any attention. It's the craziest thing possibly ever done on this kind. That a fair evaluation for a Central American specialist? If you look at those countries, think about it for a minute. They tend to have population growth rates in the vicinity of 2.5 or 3% a year. They are therefore going to, if you look at it in terms of doubling times, their doubling times are in the vicinity of, say, 25 years. You can always get the doubling time by dividing the growth rate into 70 at the lower end of the scale. In Kenya, where the population growth rate has been fluctuating around 4%, they have a doubling time of 17 years. This means that if you are a humane person and you want to maintain the standard of living in that country without changing the demographics, that in some sense, in 17 to 25 years, just to stay even, you're going to have to duplicate every amenity you have for the support of human life. That would be a hell of a big job in a rich country like the United States. It is very nearly an impossible job in many of the poor countries, and it's certainly an impossible job to keep doing it time after time again. What happens is the people in those countries have to continually plow back whatever money, whatever capital they can save into supporting more and more people. And if it was really plowed back into supporting more and more people, you'd be in a better situation than you are in most of those countries. But in many or most of those countries, of course, there's an incredibly skewed income distribution, and a lot of the capital that is generated doesn't go back into supporting the poor people at all, but goes into making the already relatively rich even richer. If you go to a place like Brazil, if you want to see what the two-tiered society is really like, go to Sao Paulo or Rio, and you can see it right before your very eyes. That is, people with enormous affluence, freeways choked with fine cars, with naked kids living in favelas that are in the 4 or 5 foot stretch between a wall and the freeway, the little metal thing about this high that divides off the freeway, living in packing cases with no water, no sanitary facilities, anything else. So you have overlain on this incredible problem of very rapid population growth around the world, and particularly in poor countries. You have the equally horrendous problem of maldistribution of income and of many people not caring. So you never want to, there are all kinds of incredible factors mixed together, but population is a very important one, and maldistribution of income is a very important one. And then, of course, all those other things I mentioned, like racism, sexism, and so on, xenophobia, all of which make it very, very difficult to get the kind of cooperative efforts we really need if we're going to save the world. One of the nice things about this, however, is to tell you that there's very little humane area you can't act in that's not going to help. In other words, if you want to think of something interesting about the human predicament, something cheery about the human predicament, it is that we're all going to have to start behaving in ways that human beings have always thought were right, with a capital R, if we're going to have a chance of saving the game. And virtually any area you go into professionally and so on will give you an opportunity to do something about changing the world. And you can do it, as I say, by fighting. If you want to fight racism, that's good, because if the world stays divided on racial, say, racial grounds, one way or another, that's going to make it all the more difficult to solve the fundamental problems. So, I want to leave you, however, with a thought that I always end my Extinction lecture with, and that's one that came from Ken Brower, the son of the famous environmentalist David Brower, and he was talking about the disappearance of the California condors. And he said, when the vultures watching your civilization begin to drop dead, it's time to pause and wonder. Thank you.